What's up, everybody? Jack here with another episode of the Big and Bold College Football Show. Today I have two topics I'm going to go over. First, we're going to start off with some of the adjustments that were made to the AP poll after the first full week of college football. And then I'm going to preview some of the big games for this weekend and get into some of my predictions for those. But like I said, let's start off with the AP poll. The first real noticeable change to the top 25 was Georgia going from 5 to 2. So obviously that comes off the heels of Georgia beating the third-ranked Clemson last Saturday. I had a breakdown of that game that you can listen to. I definitely break down that one quite a bit. Another big change, Oklahoma going from 2 to 4, coming in as the preseason second-ranked team in the AP poll, and then coming down to the fourth with a close one against Tulane. That's notable, right? That really doesn't leave them as much wiggle room as they would like the remainder of the season to remain a college football playoff team. With that said, Clemson fell from 3 to 6 because of the Georgia loss. And then we saw Iowa make a big leap from the 18th ranked team in the country to the 10th. Something probably pretty deserved. Might be a bit of a stretch. I know they dominated 17th ranked Indiana, but solid move there, putting them at 10. Reason that's really exciting, and I'm going to talk about it more, is because of their matchup this weekend. The one move I didn't like inside the top 10 was Notre Dame moving up from 9 to 8. I understand that part of that is because of Iowa State falling from 7 to 9 because they struggled against Northern Iowa. But Notre Dame struggled against Florida State as well. Jack Cohn was very productive. But it would appear that the addition of Marcus Freeman, new defensive coordinator for Notre Dame, coming by way of Cincinnati, had a very rough start with Florida State in their first game of the season, almost losing that game in overtime. So I don't like Notre Dame sitting at 8 in my personal top 25. I actually probably kicked them out of the top 10. That's kind of how the top 10 shook out. After that, another big leap for Penn State, going from 19th to 11th, so borderline top 10 team. With next week's game against Auburn, I am very sure that they are going to throw themselves into the top 10 if they win that game. Just winning this weekend can elevate them into the top 10. I don't much care for Oregon and Florida at 12 and 13. I thought Oregon's struggles against Fresno State at home probably indicates that they shouldn't be a borderline top 10 team. Florida remains the same at 13, but I didn't like them coming into the season that high anyway. Texas had a good leap from 21st to 15th, but the biggest leap was UCLA. They went from being unranked to beating Hawaii and then upsetting 16th ranked LSU and then taking their spot in the AP poll. So UCLA is now the 16th ranked team in the country. I would assume they're not going to finish that high by the end of the year. That's just me personally, but that's where they're at. Coastal Carolina bumps up from 22nd to 17th. I thought that was a pretty drastic move, maybe a couple spots higher than it should have been. Wisconsin fell from 12th to 18th with their loss to Penn State. With that, though, I think that Wisconsin's probably better than Coastal Carolina, probably better than UCLA. But starting off 0-1 is tough. You really take a hit in the AP poll. Another big stretch is Virginia Tech. They can't come in at 19th after being an unranked team, beat North Carolina. And I get it. North Carolina was a top 10 team. But they were a top 10 team. When the AP poll comes out, you have teams ranked for two main reasons: potential and proven ability. North Carolina was coming in as a top 10 team off of potential. They were 8-4 last year. It was believed that this year they were going to make a big leap to being a top 10 team. To me, this is kind of the voters here trying to advocate for how good North Carolina is and putting Virginia Tech this high, but I don't think I would have put them at 19. I also don't think I would have thrown Ole Miss in at 20, despite starting off with a win on the season. I don't think they're better than Utah, who also starts off 1-0, who comes in at 21. But they did move up 3 spots from 24th. Miami had quite the tumble, going from 14th to 22nd, losing to Alabama. And with their first win on the season, Auburn comes into at 25 to round out the AP poll. Some teams that were very close to getting in, TCU, who I do believe should be a top 25 team. You'll actually be able to see them in my top 25 this weekend. NC State, they're another borderline team. UCF and Liberty. So we'll see how the AP poll changes after this weekend. I would expect there's going to be quite the shift in the AP poll. Now, with that again is the adjustments made to the AP poll after week 1. Just kind of wanted to talk about what I liked and didn't like. So overall, I like the top 10 right now in the shape that it's in, with the exception of Notre Dame going from 9 to 8. I don't really like Notre Dame at 8 that high. Don't like Oregon and Florida at 12 and 13. And I don't know if I think Virginia Tech and Ole Miss should be in at 19 and 20. But Utah's creeping up the board, which I like. Iowa at 10 is exciting. So overall, not bad week after week 1. Now with that said, let's move into my preview for the upcoming weekend. Want to talk about some of the biggest games and also tie a couple knots on some points for week 1. So going to get those out of the way, talk about some of the big games coming up. Now, my big game for the weekend, I highlighted this as my best game of the week in the off season, is Iowa at Iowa State. And I think it's pretty obvious to understand why, right? This is a top 10 matchup, 9th ranked Iowa State and 10th ranked Iowa. I would imagine this is probably the only time that we've ever seen a top 10 matchup between these two teams. So this is really awesome. And something very unique, something that we haven't seen before. Now, when you look at the history of the game, Iowa has dominated the matchup as of late, even with Matt Campbell there at Iowa State. So history would indicate that one should side with Iowa in this game. Not to mention, walking into the game, you had an Iowa team that absolutely dominated a top 25 Indiana, 2 pick sixes, controlled the game the entire time, didn't let anything up, versus Iowa State, who played Northern Iowa and struggled 16-10 in a very surprising game. But it is worth noting that they did struggle last week. So they're really coming into this kind of with different momentum. Iowa State actually has something to prove after struggling last week. Meanwhile, Iowa's riding the momentum from their dominant performance in week 1. Now, I do like Iowa a lot this year. I did pick them to win against Indiana, and I think that they're competing for the West in the Big Ten this season. But when I try to line these two teams up against each other, Iowa State against Iowa, excluding last week's performances, excluding even the fact that this is going to be a home game for Iowa State, and just looking at their rosters, position group by position group, I like Iowa State. You look at Breece Hall at running back, who did have a disappointing performance last week, but he did give them their only offensive touchdown of the game, and it's going to be hard to contain him 2 weeks in a row, considering you look at what he did last year, scoring over 21 touchdowns on the ground, phenomenal running back that is trying to bounce back into the Heisman conversation. I like Tyler Goodson for Iowa, but he's no Breece Hall. Brock Purdy, senior quarterback for them. Big fan of his. He's a very good quarterback, throws more interceptions than he probably should, but very good quarterback. Spencer Petras for Iowa, it's all potential there. We've only seen a handful of starts for him at Iowa. And last week he wasn't tested. The entire Iowa team wasn't tested against Indiana, is really how I look at that game. Iowa State's got a massive offensive line. Granted, so does Iowa. I would say that Iowa State probably has the stronger front seven with guys like Will McDonald and Mike Rose. And their secondary is pretty loaded as well between Anthony Johnson, Greg Eisworth the second. Granted, Iowa probably has a better secondary this year than they have had in recent years as well. So It's a pretty tight matchup, but at the end of the day, when I like what a team has at quarterback, when I like what they have at running back, when I think they have better pass rushers, and they're playing at home, that's why I take Iowa State. I don't expect Iowa State to struggle 2 weeks in a row. Meanwhile, I don't think I expect Iowa to have two fantastic performances in a row. I think the ability to sort of ride out the vast majority of that game last week against Indiana may hurt them this week against an Iowa team that's going to look to limit mistakes, right? Oh, that is an Iowa State team, I mean. An Iowa State team that's going to look to minimize mistakes, unlike what Indiana was last week. I think it almost would have been better for Iowa to actually run their offense how they want to in a competitive football game. That's one negative to dominating somebody, right? I know that can be hard to find, but that is one negative. So with that said, I think it's going to be a good game, but I'm going to take Iowa State 24-21. I think it's going to be close, but I'm going to say that Iowa wins out and Breece Hall has a rebounding performance. They beat a 10th ranked Iowa, and Breece Hall gets himself back into the Heisman conversation. When you look at my pick for best game of the week for week 1, I chose obviously the Georgia-Clemson game, had Georgia winning that one, and that did come true. So let's see if my prediction is correct this week and Iowa State does in fact win. As I said, history is not on my side in this one, nor is momentum, but I do like Iowa State in this game. Next up is probably the game most people will be watching, which is Oregon at Ohio State. That's certainly the most flashy game we have. Two very large markets going at it against each other. You've got 3rd ranked Ohio State and 12th ranked Oregon. Now ideally, what would have happened setting this game up is that Oregon would have dominated Fresno State week 1 at home. Their offense would have sparked, their defense would have been dominant like we expect it to be. And then for Ohio State, maybe they struggle a little bit more against Minnesota than they did. I understand in the first half of the game specifically they did struggle, but they pulled ahead by 14, busted open with a couple big plays, and really controlled the majority of the third quarter and the fourth quarter. So Minnesota didn't have as much of a shot as people are making it out to seem in that game once you got out of the first half of the ball game. And the reason I say this is because if that was what happened between those programs, this is a much more anticipated game in my mind. But what actually happened was that Oregon struggled against Fresno State at home, only pulled ahead at the end of the fourth quarter to win that game and hold off Fresno State. And as I said, Ohio State, they pulled ahead and kind of dominated the end of that one. This is still a very highly anticipated game because you have probably the best recruited program in the Pac-12 going against the best recruited program in the Big Ten. So this is an awesome game. But the concern for me is, does this turn into Alabama-Miami from last week, where Alabama just absolutely schwacked Miami? And is that going to happen between Ohio State and Oregon? Because it's entirely possible that it does, if I'm being honest. You're going to have to wait and see. And I talked about talent, Oregon's defense has 5 stars all across their defense in the form of Noah Sewell, Justin Flo, and Drew Mathis are very good linebackers. Mikael Wright in their secondary. I think Oregon's secondary is pretty overrated, is actually going to be able to match with Ohio State fairly well. Kayvon Thibodeau, the likely number 1 pick in the upcoming NFL draft, elite pass rusher out of Oregon, is injured. It's not serious, but I'd be a little surprised if he played in this game. With that said, Ohio State did struggle defensively against Minnesota. Both elite potential in Haskell Garrett, Zach Harrison, Tyreek Smith. Their front 7 is very good. Defensively, Ohio State had a lot of problems last year, and that looked to carry over against Minnesota in week 1 of this year. But it's still a high upside defense. And I don't think Oregon is the offensive powerhouse that they were in 2019. You have to remember, and I brought this up before, in 2019, when Oregon went to the Rose Bowl, that was with Justin Herbert at quarterback. Now they've got Anthony Brown, who has looked fairly uninspiring, in my opinion, while at Oregon and while he was at Boston College before he transferred. They've got a good collection of running backs. C.J. Verdell leads the way for them. Overall, I think the C.J. Stroud to Chris Olave connection is going to be hard to stop when it comes to Ohio State. Their offensive line is pretty experienced, and they can run the football. With Master Teague, freshman Travion Henderson, Ohio State, I think, just has too much offensively to be stopped, and I would imagine they're going to have 2 or 3 big plays that separate them from Oregon. Believe me, I've seen it time and time again with Ohio State. Saw it against Minnesota. Saw it in the last couple times they've played Michigan even. It's a tied ball game, or you're within 1 score, and then next thing you know, Chris Olave gets open deep in your secondary, and now you're down by 10. Next thing you know, you're down by 17 before you know it. It just happens because the team is so explosive, and I think that's what's going to hurt Oregon. Ideally, Oregon's defense shows up. They finally play like the elite defense we want them to be, and they contain C.J. Stroud for Ohio State. But I think the defense is going to give up some points, and in all likelihood, offensively, they're probably not going to be all that great. I'm going to say Ohio State wins 37-24. I'd be willing to say 37-27, something along those lines. But we'll see what the actual game is, right? I'm hoping that Oregon's defense comes through and their offense just does enough, and that this is a very competitive game. But when I map this one out, I see Ohio State pulling ahead, Oregon maybe getting in the end zone once or twice to improve the end game score, but ultimately this is Ohio State's ball game. Prove me wrong though, Oregon. Prove me wrong. Believe me, I would love to see Oregon win this football game. Now, I'd like to point out that this is kind of a weak slate of games this weekend outside of Iowa State, Iowa, Ohio State, Oregon. So I decided I'm going to bring up a few games really quickly and knock those out. Now, the first one I want to talk about is Washington at Michigan. This was another game that, people were really excited for coming into the season. Washington, an up-and-coming team, they got into the AP poll, preseason AP poll, coming in at 20th. Michigan, meanwhile, coming off a down year. So, yes, while it's a home game for Michigan and a night game in the Big House, you've still got a very talented defense coming in, and Michigan looked vulnerable. Now, Michigan dominated Western Michigan. Granted, it's a MAC school. And Washington gets absolutely embarrassed and loses to Montana. So this game's lost its luster a little bit with that development. It's mainly just because people don't expect Washington to win now. But with that said, Washington is still a very talented team. I think Coach Lake for Washington is going to have them rebound against Michigan, because that's what they're trying to do, right? They're wounded right now. They're a wounded animal, and they're trying to rebound before their season falls apart. The last thing they want is to start off 0-2. And they're going to use Michigan in a big night game to do that, or try to do that at least. The defense is still very talented for Washington. There's no doubt about that the defense is still talented. I thought their defensive line didn't get as much push against Montana as I thought they would. But the issue wasn't the defense. They gave up 13 points. Meanwhile, offensively, they gave up 3 interceptions, so no wonder, right? It's a miracle that they only gave up 13 points off of 3 interceptions by Dylan Morris. But offensively, are they going to get it together? Their run game was absolutely terrible against Montana. How do you rebound from that? When you can't run the ball, even against a Big Sky, team, how are you going to run against a team like Michigan? Now, the path is there for Washington. Michigan brings in a new defensive coordinator. They weren't all that tested against Western. I mean, they're a good MAC team, but again, a MAC team. So they weren't all that tested last week. Lacking depth at some positions. Washington's strength is the defense. So, maybe they can contain Michigan's run game and Cade McNamara. we'll see. The path is there. There's always a path for somebody to win a football game usually. So the path is there for Washington. I don't think they win this game. Because a lot of it has to do with Michigan's culture at the program, or at least what we believe their new culture is, which is that they're practicing every day like it's Ohio State. That's what they've been talking about lately, is every day you practice to beat Ohio State, the best team in their conference and their biggest rival. And I don't think they're going to take Washington for granted, having lost to Montana. So with that, throw the game on. I think it's going to be a good game. I do think this is a couple of iconic programs. We've seen some really good games between Washington and Michigan, and I hope it's a good game. I take Michigan by 14 in this one. I'm going to say Michigan wins 28-14. Washington probably gets together a little bit. Maybe Dylan Morris improves from his awful performance last week. Like I said, no touchdowns and 3 interceptions for him. He has not looked very good for Washington. And I think if he loses badly this week, they're going to go to their 5-star freshman that's waiting behind him, which is something I've talked about before. Ultimately, throw the game on. It's a night game. It's going to be a beautiful environment in Ann Arbor. It's going to be a maze out as well, so that's going to be really nice. Next up, I want to talk really quickly about a game most people probably don't plan on watching, but Missouri at Kentucky. Both teams have started off 1-0, and the reason I want to talk about them is because I think they depending on how this game goes, the winner of this matchup can get more attention than they are in 4 or 5 weeks when you look at their schedule. Now, the problem for Kentucky last year was quarterback. If you watched their bowl game against NC State, it's a miracle they won with the quarterback play they had. So they bring in Will Levis, the transfer from Penn State. Solid quarterback. He can do a lot of things, maybe not great at any one thing. But if they beat Missouri, the rest of their schedule is Chattanooga and at South Carolina. Mind you, South Carolina, having brought in a new head coach, I don't expect Kentucky to lose that game. So that's 4-0. Now their next 3 games is pretty disgusting. Florida, LSU, and then at Georgia. As long as they win one of those games, in all likelihood either Florida or LSU, Kentucky's golden, dude. They're sitting at 5-2 at that point. They're going to be making a bowl game. They're fighting for 8 or 9 wins now, not 6 or 7, which is a big difference. Meanwhile, the same can be said for Missouri. Now, the thing I don't like about Missouri, I don't think they're as good as Kentucky. It's being played at home for Kentucky, and Missouri looked vulnerable against Central Michigan. They did give up 24 points in that game. But if they win, that's a win at Kentucky. They got Southeast Missouri, at Boston College, which can be tricky, but Tennessee and North Texas. All very winnable games. I don't think Tennessee is very good. North Texas ain't very good. These 2 SEC teams that we don't talk about a lot can put themselves in the position to win 8 or 9 games. I'm going to go out and say that it's Kentucky. And 8 or 9 wins for Kentucky is pretty good. You can also throw Texas, Arkansas in here. Texas is going to be considered the favorite, but I would love to see them get upset by Arkansas. So with all that said, that's kind of a quick preview for the upcoming weekend. Talk about some of the biggest games that we have coming up, some of the ones that maybe people aren't paying too much attention to. But what I like about this weekend is that you get a full Saturday of great games. You get Iowa State, 12 o'clock Eastern time, so I get it 11 o'clock Central time. And then Oregon, Ohio State at 3:30, Michigan with Washington at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock Eastern time. So you get a full day of really good games. So very excited for that. It's definitely going to be a good Saturday. I wish there was a little bit more to dive into for some of these games. As I said, there's only really 2 big games going on. That's Oregon at Ohio State, Iowa at Iowa State. But there's a few good games going on this weekend. Impactful games for sure. I think as the season goes along, I'm going to be able to dive deeper into these games because obviously you play more games, you build a bigger resume. It's a little easier to dive into these teams. And as I said, this weekend is kind of a weak weekend of games. Last weekend was a very strong weekend of games. So, it just alternates a little bit. But thank you for listening, everybody. Give me your score predictions in the comments. What do you think these games are going to be? What's your favorite game of the week? As I said, for me, it's Iowa at Iowa State. I'm going to give you guys a great overview of that game next week after it's played. So definitely keep an eye out for that episode. For my Wolverine fans, if you haven't watched it already, I preview the Washington at Michigan game, so check that out as well. What's an underrated game that's going to be played this weekend? You know, when you look at the schedule of the games, what's something that you think we should be keeping an eye on? I think Missouri at Kentucky is a good one. Very underrated game there. But let me know in the comments. And as I said, thanks for listening, everybody, and enjoy your weekend.